Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. We will get started in just another minute or two. Welcome, everyone, to Angel Island, more important to remember now than ever. I would like to turn it over to my counterpart for tonight, Casey Dexter Lee, to welcome us all.
Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Casey Dexter Lee. I'm an interpreter with California State Parks, and I'm located here at Angel Island State Park this evening, and I'll be presenting from here later. I want to thank you all for coming out this evening to virtually visit the park and hear a little more about the history as well as the contemporary issues around immigration in the West Coast.
Thanks, Casey. And my name is Ed Tepporn. I'm the Executive Director for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. We're the primary nonprofit partner working in partnership with Angel Island State Park to help preserve the buildings at this historic site, as well as to uplift its histories and its stories. And it's especially meaningful for us to be joining with all of you today because of two things. One, we are in the middle of May, and so we are celebrating Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And I know for myself, as someone who identifies as Asian and Pacific Islander, that this particular Asian Pacific American Heritage Month takes on even more additional meaning, especially as we've seen over the past few weeks and months, the increasing attacks against Asians and Pacific Islanders, the increasing racism, the increasing xenophobia. And for me, that is just a reminder of why it is that much more important to remember our history now more than ever, because by remembering our history, by learning from it, by relearning from it, we hopefully have the opportunity to develop increased understanding as well as increased empathy. The second meaningful piece for today is that today actually marks the anniversary of the signing of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was one of the exclusionary immigration policies that ultimately led to the creation of the former US immigration station at Angel Island. And that law was not repealed until 1943. We'll be talking a little bit later about that particular law. But for now, I'm going to share my screens and we'll get started with tonight's presentation. So what you see in front of you is what the barracks buildings looks like now. And for those of you who've had the opportunity to visit Angel Island before, perhaps this is a familiar site. We hope that you'll come back and visit because there's many new exhibits that we are excited to be sharing with you once the island and its buildings open back up. Currently, right now, you are only able to tour the outside of the site, as well as to take advantage of the hiking and biking trails on the site. Just a little bit more about the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. On the right-hand side, you see our social media handles. So if you're not already part of our email listserv, definitely please feel free to go to our website and join our email list. And if you have the opportunity to be on Facebook or Twitter, or Instagram, you can definitely stay in contact and stay connected with us to learn more about other events that we will be bringing to you over the course of the next months and years. And as you can see in the chat function, we hope that this will be an interactive event tonight. And so please definitely use the Q&A function to put in any questions that you might have for myself or for Casey. As I noted, we've seen so much anti-Asian racism and xenophobia over the past year. Our friends at Chinese for Affirmative Action and their counterparts have documented over 3,800 cases, 3,800 cases of anti-Asian hate. And we know that that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. And unfortunately, many other incidents go unreported. But what's been frustrating for me is recognizing that when we've seen some of these violent attacks, whether what happened in Atlanta or what happened recently in Indianapolis, there are questions about whether these attacks were anti-Asian. There's questions about whether Asians and Pacific Islanders can experience racism. But for those of us who identify as part of the Asian and Pacific Islander diaspora, we know that these types of attacks, this type of rhetoric, this type of thinking is nothing new, and that this anti-Asian racism and xenophobia has a long history in the US. Part of that history traces back to when we saw the first waves of Chinese immigrants coming to the US during the gold rush and then during the efforts to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. After that railroad was built, many of the Chinese laborers made their way back to towns and cities across the West Coast. But when they returned to those towns, they were seen as competitive labor for a depressed job market and for a depressed economy. And that led to many violent attacks against Chinese and other Asians, including mob riots, lynchings, and the burnings of Chinatown across cities and towns in California and across the country. Unfortunately, that racism and xenophobia wasn't restricted to just the violence. What we also saw was how that racism and xenophobia got translated into some of the country's immigration policies. And so on this page, we have an interactive activity for you. On the left-hand side of the page with the numbers are just a few of the exclusionary immigration policies that used to be in place in the US. And on the right-hand side is the impact that those laws had. So I'm going to give you just a few moments to see if you can connect the law to its corresponding impact. Which number matches which letter? Just 10 more seconds. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see if you got it right. So the first law that we have on the left-hand side is the Immigration Act of 1882. And what this law did was it's connected to item number C on the right-hand side. The Immigration Act of 1882 essentially defined this class of individuals known as likely to be public charge, or LPC for short. And if someone was considered to be coming into the country and was thought to potentially be a drain on federal resources or needing support in order to stay here in the US, then this could potentially label them as an excludable group that would not be allowed to immigrate and naturalize. So hopefully some of you got that one right. We'll move on to our next one. Next, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which today again happens to be the anniversary of. And while the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 wasn't necessarily the first law targeted to immigrants, that was actually preceded in 1875 by the Page Act, which restricted immigration from Chinese women who were stereotyped as all being prostitutes. But what the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 did was it was the first law to exclude all immigrants from a particular country from naturalizing. And so if you were Chinese, you could not become a US citizen. And this law really was created to try to prohibit Chinese laborers from coming into the US. There were some exceptions for the Chinese Exclusion Act, including if you were a merchant or if you were a scholar or if you were temporarily visiting. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was definitely created with this racist and xenophobic intention of keeping Chinese from coming to the US. Next, we have the 1921 Emergency Quota Act, which connects to impact number D. And so what this act did was it imposed the first permanent numerical limits on immigration. Ultimately, what the act deemed was that only 3% of the people from a particular country currently living in the US would be the numerical limit of who was allowed to immigrate. And so that definitely had implications for Asian Pacific Islanders in that based on the numbers at the time, there were many more immigrants from Europe than there were from Asian countries. And so there were fewer, the limits were definitely smaller for Asian immigrants in Asian countries. And then finally, we have the Titins Mcduffie Act. And so this particular act had the wonderful impact of giving the country of the Philippines their independence. But once they were no longer considered a US affiliated territory or colony, then the Philippines joined the list of the barred countries. And by 1934, the total of all these different immigration laws, not just these that you see on the screen, but several other ones, ultimately prohibited immigration and naturalization from most Asian Pacific Islander countries unless they happen to be a territory of the US. So that's these immigration laws. And it's because of these immigration laws that the former US immigration station at Angel Island was developed. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see an overview map of what the site looks like today. And it's important to remember that not all of Angel Island was used as an immigration station. It was just this portion of the northeast corner. Angel Island itself is about 1 square mile. And so just a portion of Angel Island was set aside for the US immigration station. For me, as I continue to learn about the history of Angel Island, I know that growing up in Texas, I was never taught about the history of Angel Island, but I definitely learned about Ellis Island. And I was taught how the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island were these symbols of how our country has welcomed immigrants to the US. And sometimes Angel Island has been referred to as the Ellis Island of the West. And I think that's an easy name to remember, but what's important to also remember is that Angel Island's history and its role in US immigration was very different from that of Ellis Island. Instead of welcoming immigrants, Angel Island was specifically built to process and to detain immigrants. And on this screen, you see just some of the different countries that came through Angel Island, people who were either processed or detained on Angel Island. For those of you who might be familiar with Angel Island's history, sometimes you might affiliate it with being a Chinese detention site or Japanese detention site. And definitely Chinese and Japanese immigrants were the largest groups of detainees on Angel Island. But it's also important to remember that from 1910 to 1940, there were over 500,000 people who were processed or detained at Angel Island. And these people came from over 80 different countries. So take a quick look at this and see if the country that you perhaps came from or the country that your family might have immigrant heritage from is on this list. For me personally, Thailand up in the upper right-hand corner is part of the countries on the list. And for me and my family, although we didn't immigrate through Angel Island, we did immigrate from Thailand to Texas in the early 1970s. And I always wonder what my immigration journey would have been like if I had been born during the Angel Island time. So again, these pictures are just a reminder of the diversity of the people who were processed or detained at Angel Island. In the upper right-hand corner, you do see images of young boys who were in detention at Angel Island. We know from historical records that men, women, and children were detained on Angel Island. If I'd been traveling with my mom through Angel Island at the time and I was over the age of 12, I would have been separated from her and forced to stay in the barracks portion with the other Asian men and boys. And these are just some additional images that showed a diversity of different groups of people who were detained and were processed at Angel Island. All these images are courtesy of California State Parks. And for me, what these images help me to remember is that these numbers, 500,000, it's not just a number, but it's individual people. It's people's lives, people's families that were impacted by these exclusionary immigration policies and exclusionary immigration practices. And so looking at these pictures, I often wonder about what were the hopes that these people brought with them to the US? What was it like for them to experience the trauma of being in detention? And how did they continue to stay strong and resilient through their processing and detention? And fortunately, we have the benefit of poems that were carved into the detention barrack walls. We have the benefit of oral histories of those who experienced detention on Angel Island, as well as the stories that they passed on to their descendants. And we invite you, if you are an immigrant who is a descendant of someone who came through Angel Island, or if you're an immigrant yourself who perhaps came to the US after Angel Island, we would love for you to share your story with us so that we can add them to our Immigrant Voices story and tell the full diversity of immigration, both through Angel Island historically, as well as in immigration that's happening currently now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Casey to give you a chance to see what the detention barracks look like now on Angel Island. This picture on the right-hand side is a historical picture. And as soon as I turn off my camera and these slides, you'll see a live view from Casey in the detention barracks.
Thank you, Ed. So California State Parks is the entity that protects this site. And in addition to being a California State Park, this site is also a National Historic Landmark because of its significance, not only to California history, but to US history. And I'm inside of the detention barracks, which is one of several buildings that are still standing on the site. The administration building, when that burned down in 1940, caused this place to close, and the building was abandoned for quite a while. Now today, a lot of restoration work has gone on inside of this building. It might not look like a fresh coat of paint, but that's the one thing we can't do in this building because of the writing on the walls, which I will show you in just a second. So inside of this room, the area you can see was considered healthy for 25 people and had 100 beds. So that's why you see these triple layer bunk beds. They're modeled after what were on ships of that era, and it allowed more people to be squished into the space than were really healthy to be here. These beds do fold up, so if it's unoccupied, you could remove the bedding, lock the bed in an upright position, and have a little more space and elbow room. But you can actually see worn into the floor where people walked up and down. It's a lighter color than under the beds because there really wasn't a lot of other space. There's a little bit of space down at the end of the room and indoor recreation space that was quite small for the amount of people in here. And then there were some outdoor recreation areas that were racially segregated as well. So this room was for Chinese men. And when we say Chinese men, we do mean boys down to 12 years old or so, although I have spoken to people as young as 9 years old that were sent to the men's side. And in the case of that gentleman, it was because he was tall. And so he was perceived as being older than he was. So at 9 years old, he was on his own over here on the men's side. There's no ladders or anything to move up and down these beds. These are reproductions, so I can touch them and stand on them. But basically you just climb up and stepping on the beds of the people below to get up to those upper bunks. So I'm going to take you over to a spot where we can see the wall a little better. And on our way, we'll take a peek out the window. And you can see, well, it might be a nice view. Even if we open up this window, you'll see that there's no getting out this way. This place was a detention facility. The people here thought of themselves as prisoners. Although they were not classified as prisoners by the Immigration Service, they were allowed to have personal items, even knives and carving tools that helped create the writing here on the walls. But people were not allowed to come and go as they pleased. There was a lot of restrictions to where you could go and when you could go there. There were 3 meals a day. You could go down to the dining hall. There was segregation there as well, and as well as separate food for different groups of people. So there was a European meal and an Asian meal. Here's that spot I was talking about where you can see some of the writing on the walls fairly well. And this area was actually a little bit of a scientific experiment to try and understand what's going on underneath the layers of paint. Now, this top dominant yellow and gray we see throughout the building today is actually from a later period from World War II. This building had a second life after the immigration station closed as a detention facility for prisoners of war, as well as Japanese Americans, primarily Japanese Hawaiians that were interned during World War II. This was a transient location during World War II, so people were passing through this facility to others. And most of the Japanese Hawaiians, which were the largest group to come through here, were moved from place to place during the course of the war. So underneath that World War II era writing, we see these other colors. And this is actually going back in time all the way to when the walls were unpainted when the building first opened. And if we look closely, we can see that there is some putty inside of these letters. And that putty was put in to try and smooth out and erase the writing that was on the wall because it was considered graffiti at the time. Now today, it's still graffiti, but today it's graffiti we appreciate and protect and are really grateful for because it gives us a chance to listen to the people who were here, whose stories might not otherwise have been told because people were fearful. They were worried about being deported. Many of the Chinese immigrants that came through here had to take on false identities to get around the Chinese exclusion laws and the racism of that era. And so if you were found out, you might be deported. So a lot of people didn't talk about this chapter of their history, even with their own families or children. And I've heard many people tell me that they didn't know that their parent had a paper name until after they had passed away, when they would hear from other friends or relatives. So this poem here, I'm going to read an English translation. This section here is just a part of it. It actually extends above and below. And this has some pretty strong emotions in it. So, 1,000 sorrows and a hatred 10,000-fold burns between my brows. Hoping to step ashore the American continent is the most difficult of difficulties. The barbarians imprison me in this place. Even a martyr or a hero would change countenance. So you can see from this poem, even a hero, even someone better than me, right? Better than the author, someone better than me would be changed by this place. Now the poems cover a range of topics. Many of them are like this. They're sad, frustrated, angry. There's poems that talk about the practicalities of this experience. There's poems about the long journey across the ocean. There's poems about the bad food in the dining hall, the invasive medical exams that people experienced. There's poetry about the poetry. There's a poem downstairs that says there are tens of thousands of poems on these walls. They're all cries of complaint and sadness. Now, it doesn't actually mean there are tens of thousands of poems here. There are hundreds of poems. But when you're in the building, you really can see that there's writing everywhere. And poetry is not necessarily meant to be full of facts, but it is full of feelings. And it creates a picture in our mind of what people were trying to convey. So some of the poems are more hopeful, talking about the next chapter, talking about putting this chapter behind them. And we see a reflection of different education levels in the poetry, as well as artistic endeavors on the walls as well, because not everyone is a poet. And we do think that the people who wrote poems like this had at least an 8th grade education. It would be very typical to study poetry in school in China during this era, and being able to write poetry would have been normal for at least a primarily educated person. Now, of course, the people who were not literate didn't write on the walls, so we don't know as much about their stories. And I'm going to take you over to the other side of this room where we can see some photos. So there's a variety of kind of setups in this room. This one, no bunks. And this room is actually the other half of the room I just left. And so this wall in the center was added during World War II. So during the immigration era, this entire room would have been considered healthy for 50 and had 200 beds. And there would have been, again, you can see that path worn down the middle from people walking up and down between the rows of beds. Over here, we have some photographs. Immigrants arriving. on the stairs of the hospital building. And this one is of the medical exam. Now the medical exams, ooh, sorry, I got a little wobble in my stand there. The medical exams primarily took place in the hospital building. You can see folks are lined up for a line exam. Now there's a couple of things when we look at these historic photos that we know that they are likely staged. And that is one, right, you had to stand very still to take a photograph during this period. If you moved, the photograph would be blurry, and we actually can see some examples of that over here where someone moved and there's a little blur in the photo. But the other thing is we don't naturally line up by height. And you can see that the taller people are towards the back, the shorter people near the front. And as we look at these folks, we can see a lot of these people are quite young. And it was pretty common for people around 12 years old to be considered old enough to come to America to join their father. And even if their father went to China and traveled with them, when they arrived, their father would be re-entering and would not have to come to Angel Island as long as he had filed paperwork before he left. So those boys, even though they had traveled with their parent, would end up here on Angel Island by themselves. All right, are there any questions while I'm here in the barracks building? I'll take you over to see a little more writing in another room if you like. That's our entry hearing photo. So the entry hearings, in addition to some of the exceptions that Ed mentioned, as far as merchants and coming for education or tourism, the entry hearings were also looking for people that were coming as the children of American citizens. That's a big exempt class that a lot of Chinese immigrants came in under. I saw a question, I think we were asking about TB, tuberculosis. So tuberculosis would definitely be one of the medical conditions that we're being screened for. The medical screening is additionally complicated here because there is an element of wanting to quarantine, keep illnesses out of San Francisco and beyond. But the way it was applied here definitely had a racist element to it because people from China and sometimes other Asian countries, depending on the era, so it changed a little bit over the 30 years of operation, would be treated differently than folks coming from Europe. So most Europeans here were actually from Russia. So they weren't actually European, they were Asian. The Russian continent is on Asia, but it was really about being white. That European classification was about being white, not your country of origin. And so the medical exams, particularly Asian immigrants, had to provide stool samples to be examined for parasitic infections. A lot of people coming from rural areas would be affected by parasitic infections. And so there was kind of this collaboration between the immigration service and the public health service or marine hospital service, depending on the era. And the doctors at the hospital have these dual purpose. One job is to keep people healthy, to make people better, and the other is to help exclude. So the immigration service would look at a group of people and say, hey, we are interested in excluding people from this location. So say India, or India was a big example. So they would ask the doctors, what are illnesses common in India? And the doctors would identify things, and then they would make those particular ailments deportable diseases. So that it was easier to deport people based on medical reasons, and you didn't have to do a much deeper dive. There was treatment available for folks at the hospital, but it often was tied in with your ability to pay. So if you didn't have the financial resources to pay for medicine, that could lead to your deportation while you were still afflicted with that illness. And if you had support from a community organization, they might be able to help pay for that. And that is what led to the success of many Chinese immigrants coming in, is those community ties, access to lawyers for the appeals process, because 50% of Chinese immigrants failed the entry hearing. So did 50% of Indian immigrants, but less than 10% of Chinese immigrants were deported because of those community ties and access to lawyers. Indian immigrants, all 50% were deported. And that is because they didn't have as long a history in the US and not as much community support. Ed, am I turning things back over to you?
Yeah, we've got two more questions. If you can take one of them, I'll take the other. But one of the questions is, by any chance, were any of these boys or others shown in the photos identified of that medical exam? Were any of these folks identified?
So we don't know the names of the folks in these photos. We do have other images in the museum space, and especially over at the Angel Island Immigration Museum, where we do know people's names. We know a few of the women that are in photos in the downstairs area where we represent the women's experience. And mostly because if we know who it is, we need to get permission to use that image. And so that has connected us with the families, and many families have donated images to be included in our museum spaces.
Thanks, Casey. We're gonna move on with the presentation, and we'll have Casey actually make her way to the next building that she's gonna be helping to live tour for us, which is the Angel Island Immigration Museum. John, in response to your question of, is there a book that covers a lot of the history of Angel Island? This book here is what I use as my reference text. It's Angel Island, Immigrant Gateway to America. It's by Erica Lee and the late Judy Young. And this is a really wonderful book, in that it does talk about the histories of many different immigrant groups who came through Angel Island. And so this is definitely one of the books that I would highly recommend. On our Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation website, www.aiisf.org, we also have a resources page that lists many other wonderful books. There's some books that have taken the poems and translated them and documented them. There are also some books that are age appropriate for younger children that tell the story of Angel Island. And so if you check out our website, and we can type in that website into the chat so that you can directly link to that and find some additional great reading materials, as well as some wonderful films that have been developed by different filmmakers such as Felicia Lowe, some videos of former detainees who were interviewed and who shared their oral histories with us, as well as a whole collection of different images, both historical and contemporary, related to Angel Island. As Casey's making her way over to the Angel Island Immigration Museum, what we wanted to talk about today too as well, especially because it's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, is how our histories, our stories in the Asian Pacific Islander communities are often seen through different lenses or different narratives or different stereotypes. So for example, what you see on the screen is that of being a perpetual foreigner. And so this is a stereotype where, regardless of how long an individual from the Asian Pacific Islander community or our family has lived in the US, that we or our descendants are always seen as not being completely American, or that we're seeing as being less than, or not being from here. And so most often the way that we experience this is in casual conversation. We might be getting to know someone or meeting them for the first time, and they'll ask us very candidly, where are we from? And for me, because I grew up in Texas, I would respond by saying, I'm from Texas. But then what many immigrants often experience is this follow-up question of getting asked, but where are you really from? And again, that is just one small example of how we are seen as perpetual foreigners, even though for myself, I've lived here in the US for almost 50 years. Another narrative that we often experience is that of invisibility. And so that's where think about the media and think about the entertainment, perhaps not as much in recent years, but going back 5-10 years. How often did you see images or stories or actors who were of Asian and Pacific Islander descent? If you work in a field like education or in civil rights or in housing or in economics, think about some of the different reports that you might have read or some of the presentations you might have seen your colleague present, and how often was Asian and Pacific Islander data presented. Before I joined the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, I actually worked in the field of public health. And I can count on so many hands. I definitely have more than two hands, but time after time, I'd be in a conference or a meeting, and there would be a chart or a graph that said such and such disease by race ethnicity. And the information, the data that was provided on that chart was only for white communities, for Black communities, and for Hispanic communities. Oftentimes, the data for Asian Pacific Islander communities, as well as for American Indian communities, was either completely left off or put into this meaningless other category. And so this narrative of invisibility is one that we often experience as Asian Pacific Islanders, where our community's histories, our stories, our realities aren't necessarily represented in the news, in politics, or in entertainment. Fortunately, we're making progress on that, but there's still a ways to go, especially in terms of recognizing the full diversity of the 50 different ethnic groups that speak 100 different languages that are part of the Asian and Pacific Islander diaspora. And here's just a quick example of what I was describing in terms of a chart or graph that where our community's data is rendered invisible. The next narrative or stereotype is that of the model minority myth. And at first glance, you might think that this is actually a positive stereotype. And it's the stereotype that all Asians, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are universally wealthy and well-educated, that we are doing okay as a community. But this is a stereotype, a narrative that is actually harmful for our communities on two different fronts. One is that, again, we're a very diverse community, and while there are some members of our community who are successful and who are well-educated and are wealthy, there's a whole spectrum of experiences, and there are members of our communities who are really struggling. And when we have this model minority myth, it makes it that much more difficult for these individuals, these families, these communities, or the advocates or organizations who are working on their behalf to get the resources or the attentions to these people who are struggling. The model minority myth is also damaging to Asian Pacific Islander communities because it was specifically created to drive a wedge between us and other racial ethnic communities. And so while we might experience racism and injustices that are similar or maybe different from our brothers and sisters in the African American community, in the Latino, Latina, Latinx community, or in the American Indian community, or other marginalized communities, what the model minority myth does is it creates this wedge between us and these other communities that we actually might be aligned with in terms of working together towards a better future for all of our communities. And then when we look at how all of these narratives impact what we're experiencing now, I get asked a lot of times, how can I be an ally for Asian and Pacific Islander communities? And so we wanted to share this resource from Stop AAPI Hate. And these are just some suggestions where if you happen to witness hate, these are 5 steps that you can potentially take to help out the person who's experiencing the hate. One is by taking action, and that's again only if you feel safe doing so, to approach the targeted person, perhaps introduce yourself and offer your support. The second is to actively listen before taking any actions. Perhaps ask the targeted person if they would like help, and if they don't, then respect that and perhaps just monitor the situation. Third is to ignore the attacker. Sometimes by paying attention to the attacker, we might actually antagonize the situation. Fourth is by accompanying the targeted person. So if the situation does happen to escalate, is there a way that you could potentially accompany the person in getting out of that physical space? And then fifth is by offering emotional support. For any of us, whether it's a physical attack, an emotional slur, or racial slur, it can be definitely jarring. And so one way that you can potentially assist someone who has been attacked is by offering them emotional support. I also get asked, what can you do if you yourself are the victim and are experiencing hate? So number one is to have safety first. Make sure that you are taking account and assessing the current situation, your surroundings. If you feel unsafe and you're able to, then get out if you can. The second is to stay calm. So definitely for many of us, when we find ourselves in the situation, it can be a very stressful moment. But are there ways that we can de-escalate the stress that we're feeling in ourselves? Third is by speaking out. Are there ways that we can draw attention to ourselves so that other people recognize what's going on? And that's definitely something that when I experienced being violently attacked, I started yelling. And I was very fortunate in that the cars that happened to be driving by actually stopped and pulled over. Fourth is to seek immediate support. So one of the things I did cry out was help, help, help. And so that did attract the attention of folks. And once I was able to get away from the attacker, one of the people who'd stopped in their car let me get into their car and drove me to a safe space. And then fifth is, again, seeking emotional support. You can feel so violated when something like this happens to you, even whether it's a physical attack or whether it's an emotional slur or a racial slur. Get emotional support, talk to your friends. So often in Asian Pacific Islander cultures, it's taboo for us to talk about mental health or to seek out mental health, but especially after experiencing hate. This is where seeking out professional counseling or just even talking with our friends and family can be a key road to our mental and emotional recovery from what we experienced. Before I go to this slide, I also get asked again, how can I be an ally to Asian and Pacific Islander communities? And so being an ally doesn't necessarily have to just be in the context of when a violent attack happens. I'm sure that many of you who are watching have Asian Pacific Islander friends and know that these are stressful times for many of us who identify as Asian Pacific Islanders. With each attack that we see in our communities, especially those attacks that are targeted towards our elders and towards our women, it's very traumatizing, it's very angering, it's very saddening, it's all these emotions all at once. And even if you don't know exactly what to say, simply reaching out and saying something as simple as, I'm sorry this is happening, shows us that we have friends who care about us, our families, and our communities. Another way that you can be an ally is something you're already doing now, is by taking the opportunity to learn more about Asian and Pacific Islander communities and our histories, and hopefully by sharing what you learn with your friends and family. And a third very easy way of being an ally is never asking someone where they're from, recognizing that it might be a question that you have that's just based out of pure curiosity, well-meaning curiosity. When someone who's Asian Pacific Islander gets asked that question, the message that we internally hear often is, you're not from here. So those are just three simple ways that you can be an ally very, very easily. Before I turn it over to Casey, because it is Asian and Pacific Islander American Heritage Month, this is also an opportunity for us to celebrate the contributions, the strengths, the resilience of Asians and Pacific Islanders, both those who came to the US historically, as well as those who live in the US now. And so we do have a couple of notable Angel Island detainees. On the left-hand side is world-renowned I.M. Pei, who was a very famous architect who created and designed buildings all across the world. Many of you might also be familiar with Tyrus Wong in the middle, who, as he became an adult, became part of the Disney animation team and is responsible for many of the beautiful backdrops that many of us have seen watching the movie Bambi. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we see the Begay family and the Begay family. And what's important to recognize about the Begay family's experience is that while they were ultimately able to navigate the immigration process and enter the US, they actually experienced significant racism and xenophobia once they tried to settle in the US. And that's not an unlikely experience. That's a very similar experience to what many other Angel Island detainees experienced once they were able to make it through to Angel Island. In the Begay family's case, they had tried to settle in Berkeley. They'd bought a house in Berkeley, but their neighbors actually barred the door and kept them from moving in. We also know that there are a number of descendants of Angel Island detainees who have made their mark in many different sectors, in news, in arts and entertainment, in filmmaking, in politics, in the Silicon Valley sector, in the academic sectors. And so these are it's just a small snippet of the many, many descendants of Angel Island detainees who shared their stories with us. And so as I turn it over to Casey to let you see what the Angel Island Immigration Museum located in the site's former hospital building looks like now, I did want to give you this quick trip back in time to see what the hospital building looked like, the state of deterioration that it was in before the 7-year, $12 million renovation process took place. And as I turn it over to Casey, she'll give you a live example of what the hospital building site looks like now. And I did see that in the chat box, we do have a couple of questions that came in. Once Casey shares some of the views of the exhibits in the hospital building, we'll get to some of those questions.
Thanks so much, Ed. Thank you for sharing your personal story as well. That really was touching for me. I just wanted to highlight this view because that's one of the photos Ed just showed of the before the restoration work here at the hospital building. Today, AIM, Angel Island Immigration Museum, is a contemporary museum space, so a little different than what we've done over at the barracks. And these spaces, we have primarily exhibits on the second floor of the building, and we have 3 permanent exhibits that have been put into the park. We haven't opened to the public yet. The exhibits were just installed last winter. And we hope as conditions improve and ferry service increases, we'll be able to open these spaces back up to the public, and this one for the first time ever. So inside of under the microscope space, there's 3 rooms here. These are historic spaces that were used by the doctors. They're kind of offices, sleeping areas, pharmacy, surgery. And so the exhibits in these spaces are telling the stories of the hospital and historically, but also contemporary medical gatekeeping. So we do have a couple little moments that touch on the current pandemic, as well as the HIV ban that kept people with HIV and AIDS from coming into the country even temporarily, which is now no longer in effect. But these exhibits here give us some interactive opportunities. So there's some actions that we have people take. So let's do cover your face, all right? So we're gonna cover our face. And after we do that, we open this up and we read, what makes you blush? In 1939, Chinese immigrant Li Hui Yu was mortified during her exam. She wrote, when the doctor came, I had to take off all my clothes. It was so embarrassing and shameful. I didn't really want to let him examine me, but I had no choice. So these medical exams could be very uncomfortable for people. There wasn't a lot of effective communication that was happening during these. There sometimes were translators available, but really just to give instructions. Stand over there, do this, do that. Not how we might experience going to a medical professional today where they explain what they're doing and why they're doing it. It was an exam to find fault in the people that were here. They were looking for anything that might be wrong with you that would give the immigration service an opportunity to deport you. We also, here at this site, saw people being examined in age examinations, particularly Chinese immigrants that were potentially using a false identity. The immigration officials would doubt the true age of the immigrant and ask the doctors to medically verify their age. So everything from looking at which teeth have erupted will give you an idea of the age of someone. But they were also looking at people's naked bodies to assess if they'd gone through puberty or what stage of puberty they were in. So it could be very humiliating, very uncomfortable, and as Li Hui described, feelings of shame that are associated with this. So we also have in our exhibits here a room called In the Shadows. And In the Shadows is telling the stories of the difficult side of immigration and some of the realities of immigration today. And so we see images of border crossings. And this man here, Jose, he is an undocumented immigrant that is an activist for undocumented people in the United States. But we also pair that with what's going on historically. And so this is really a great chance to start conversations with people about these stories of immigration, the similarities of what has happened historically and what's happening today. And our hope is that people will start those conversations. We don't necessarily want people to learn history so that they know facts about the past. We want people to learn history so they can apply that to what they're experiencing in their lives today and take action. So this is a little timeline of different laws and acts that inhibited Chinese Asian immigration. The Asiatic Barred Zone, that entire red region, all the countries that were basically banned from immigration. The quotas were so low as to be negligible. And so after 1924, when that passes, very few people can come in. And then this, at the end, we start to see the loosening up of some of those laws. But most of the stories in these spaces are individuals. And we really wanted to highlight personal experiences to help demonstrate the stories and the laws that we're trying to teach people here. And so this is Ming Ji. We also have an audio clip from him talking about his experience. And this is a chance to kind of do a deep dive into his story of being a paper son. He actually didn't know he was a paper son. He was very young when he immigrated to the United States with his family. And it was only when he was applying for scholarships to go to college that he didn't have a birth certificate, which was one of the things, and social security number, those things that he needed for legal documents. And so that put him on a path of discovery about his own immigration story. And we have quotes and many stories from all corners of the world. I'm going to take you over to our Opening Doors exhibit as well. And maybe if there's some questions, we can answer those along the way.
Casey, there was one question that came in, and it was whether the examinations for men and women were the same.
Not entirely. Women's immigration was very dependent on the men in their lives. So either your father or your husband. Women that did not have a man in their life, it was very challenging to come in because there were a lot of suspicions around women being brought in for quote unquote immoral purposes, so being accused of prostitution. And there were also challenges to making a living if you were a woman. So, pay still isn't equal between men and women in the US for work. And those disparities were even larger historically. So particularly women from Japan, for instance, there were a lot of picture brides that came through here. They would be asked very few questions. Typically things like, are you going to work outside of the household? Now, this is a trick question. You have to say no, because if you said yes, you would be being brought in as a laborer. So you would say, no, you're just going to work inside the home. And then basically questions about, are you really married to this person? And then most of the questions would go to the Japanese husband that was already living here in the United States. And the immigration officials would go more in depth to make sure that he had the economic means to take care of a wife, where he lived. Did they have, anytime someone could have a witness that was white, a Caucasian witness to support the information they were giving the Immigration Service was seen as more reliable information. So there was a lot of, right, racism even in how they listened to the response that the Immigration Service listened to the responses people were giving. There weren't a lot of women coming in general, about 7 men for every 1 woman. And so there's a big disparity, and that's why women were moved out of the barracks building into the administration building, is because they needed that space for men.
Thank you, Casey. If you can give us a quick tour of the Opening Doors exhibit, we're about 5 minutes from the end of the webinar. We also want to see if there's any other questions that folks might have.
So those of you with Bay Area connections might recognize Tweed Boo. She's a reporter and affiliated with PBS and other local stations. So she tells her story as a refugee coming from Vietnam. And Opening Doors, the idea in here are kind of the more hopeful stories of immigration, refugee resettlement, the 1965 immigration laws that open up immigration finally to Asian immigration. And so we get to hear her story. If you haven't heard her story, it is heart-wrenching. Her family had to separate when they were fleeing the fall of Saigon, where she was born, and they were very fortunate and they were reunited, but their family had to make a lot of tough choices along the way. They eventually settled in the Midwest and then came to California. And she's just a really great storyteller. We have an audio clip from her as well. We mentioned Tyrus Long. We have a panel about Tyrus here. You can see some of his other art. Bambi is by far the most well-known work that he did, but this is an art piece that his family selected to be representative of his work. And this is a bok choy painting that was on a menu for the Dragon's Den, a restaurant where a lot of the artists would gather in Los Angeles.
Thanks, Casey. We're going to use the rest of the time to answer some of the Q&A that might have come in, but it looks like you want to just talk about Sammy Lee very quickly.
Oh, I was just giving you something different to look at. Sammy Lee we actually have 2 Americans that are featured in the Immigration Museum. And Sammy Lee was born here in the United States to Korean parents. And, but he experienced a lot of that same xenophobia and racism that Asian immigrants have experienced. And so it tells a story about his path to becoming an Olympic diver and what he had to do to get access to public pools and public spaces that were segregated. And in the Shadows room, Erica Alfaro, who is Mexican-American, is the American featured in there. She identifies as an immigrant because she spent time in both the US and Mexico growing up. And so it's just, there's a story here that people can connect to, and that was the goal with this space. When you come here, you'll see someone that reflects part of your family's experience.
Thanks, Casey. There was a question earlier about if there is a list of all the immigrants who were detained on Angel Island. And so definitely, as typed into the chat, there are resources available at the National Archives for the information that we do have. Unfortunately, there's not a whole list available. The site stopped being used as an immigration station in 1940 due to a fire that broke out in the administration building. And many of the records of the people who were detained were destroyed, unfortunately, in that fire. But at the National Archives, what we do have are some of the ship manifests and passenger logs. And sometimes that gives us clue to which immigrants might have passed through Angel Island. I am just scrolling to see if there might be any additional questions. It doesn't look like, oh, there is one question here about the women's restrooms, Casey, and that there doesn't seem to be any stalls in the women's restrooms. And this person had heard that the women would wear bags over their heads to keep their privacy. Is this something that is true?
So this is actually a story that was, we believe, told by one of the early pioneers to save the immigration station, Paul Chow. I think he gets credit for this story. Paul told a lot of stories, and some of them were fish stories. But his goal was to get people interested in and understand what this place was and support it. Now we've had the opportunity to do a lot more research. We understand the realities of the difficult position people were put in here, the racism they faced, the discrimination. So that is actually a story that is not true, because the bathroom that we see in the museum today is an addition from 1912. The women were moved out of that building sometime in the first 6 months to 2 years. So they moved out of that building before that addition was built. The original restrooms we have photographs of, there are stalls. And we believe that it was the same design in the administration building from the plans that we've seen, although that building is gone, we can't see it directly. So that is a story that I have heard also associated with Japanese internment, Japanese American internment. And so it might be kind of a melding of some of that historical fact with a different location. But the women here definitely were experiencing hardship. The restrooms don't appear to be a place where that was as true.
Thank you so much, Casey, for giving us a live tour of the island and sharing what people have to look forward to when the buildings on Angel Island open back up. Again, we want to acknowledge that today, this month, is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Tonight's session is part of the San Francisco Asian Pacific American Heritage Month celebration, and you can go to www.apasf.org to see a whole calendar of other events that are happening over the course of this entire month by some of our fellow sister and brother organizations across the Bay Area. And if you were intrigued, if you were inspired, if you learned something and you want to stay connected with us, we wanted to share with you again our social media and websites so that you can continue to follow us and continue to learn more about future events that we will be planning together over the course of the next weeks, months, and years. And definitely stay tuned for the opening of the Angel Island Immigration Museum. We're hoping that that building will finally be opening to the public later this year, perhaps in late summer, early fall. It will be the first time that this particular building will ever have been open to the public. So as you saw from the quick walkthrough that Casey just gave us, there has been a lot of work, a lot of heart put into curating the exhibits to tell a diverse story of immigration through Angel Island and beyond. And we can't wait to share it with you. In the meantime, on our website, www.aiisf.org for the foundation, there are ways that you can virtually visit Angel Island, whether it is the virtual exhibitions that we've curated over the past year. We also have links to a collaboration between Angel Island State Park and another nonprofit called SciArc and the foundation, where you can experience a 3D virtual tour of the Angel Island Immigration Barracks and 2 rooms within it that's narrated by Casey. And then we're very excited that we just recently launched this week a new page where you can find many different artifacts and pictures related to Angel Island on the Google Arts and Culture page. And so we're proud to be joining Google Arts and Culture in helping to lift up some of these different histories and stories. So with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight and hope that you have a happy and wonderful and safe Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Casey, are there any final words that you want to leave our guests with?
Oh, just thank you so much for coming this evening and learning a little more about our story here on Angel Island. We are at California State Park, so this park belongs to you. So please come out and check it out when it's safe and appropriate for you and your family. And we do have those online resources if you're not able to come in person, if you're a little too far away.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening and a happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month.